If you listen closely to the silence emanating from the State Department right now, you can hear the distinct, terrifying sound of an empire realizing it has lost the plot. History does not always announce its turning points with a bang. Sometimes it arrives in the chaotic fragmentation of alliances that were once considered the bedrock of global order. We are witnessing one of those moments, a Suez moment for the 21st century, but far messier and far more dangerous for the architects of American hegemony. For decades, the standard operating procedure of the United States in the Middle East was predicated on a simple, arrogant assumption that its allies were not sovereign nations with their own existential interests, but rather chess pieces to be moved at the will of the grandmasters in Washington. The Twin Pillars strategy, the reliance on the Gulf monarchies to secure energy flows and check Iranian influence, was the unshakable foundation of the Pentagon's map. But yesterday, that map was set on fire, not by a hostile power, not by Russia, not by China, and not even by Iran. It was incinerated by the very allies Washington claimed to control. The news confirming that the Royal Saudi Air Force has physically bombed assets belonging to the United Arab Emirates in the Yemeni port of Mukalla is not just a diplomatic spat, it is a geostrategic earthquake. When Riyadh drops ordinances on a weapons shipment sent by Abu Dhabi, its closest historical partner, its brother in the Gulf Cooperation Council, and its fellow customer of the American military-industrial complex, we have crossed the Rubicon. The subsequent announcement by the UAE that it is immediately withdrawing its military forces from Yemen is not a de-escalation. It is the acrimonious divorce of the anti-Iran coalition. It is the end of the fiction that the United States presides over a coherent order in the Middle East. This event is the final nail in the coffin of the unipolar moment, because it proves definitively that the United States can no longer enforce discipline within its own ranks. To understand the magnitude of this failure, we must look backward to the era when American hegemony was a terrifying reality rather than a fading nostalgia. Consider the Cold War. When the United States was the undisputed hegemon of the West, it did not tolerate dissent, let alone fratricide, among its vassal states. If a Latin American government drifted too far from the script, the CIA orchestrated a coup before breakfast. If European allies stepped out of line during the Suez Crisis of 1956, Washington threatened to crash their economies until they retreated. The Monroe Doctrine was not just a policy for the Western Hemisphere. It became the spiritual template for how Washington viewed the entire globe, a sphere of influence where no rival power centers were permitted, and certainly no independent wars between vassals were allowed. In that era, the idea that Saudi Arabia and the UAE, two nations whose militaries are trained, equipped, and theoretically integrated by the Pentagon, would be engaging in kinetic warfare against each other would have been laughable. The White House would have made one phone call, threats would have been issued, and the ships in Mukalla would have turned around. But that era is dead. The phone call was likely made, and it was ignored. Or worse, it wasn't even made because Washington is so paralyzed by its own incoherence that it no longer knows what to say. The collapse we are seeing in Yemen is the inevitable result of a foreign policy based on coercion and hypocrisy. For years, the United States turned a blind eye to the divergence of interest between Riyadh and Abu Dhabi because it was convenient. It assumed that their shared reliance on American security guarantees would override their competing ambitions for regional dominance. Washington believed that as long as they kept buying F-35 seconds and Patriots, they would remain obedient satraps. But this realist analysis exposes the fatal flaw in that thinking. Nations act in their own survival interests, regardless of what the imperial center dictates. The UAE's seizure of Yemen's southern ports and oil fields through its proxy, the Southern Transitional Council, STC, was a direct challenge to Saudi Arabia's national security. Riyadh views Yemen as its backyard, its soft underbelly. It could not tolerate an Emirati client state controlling its southern border, even if that meant bombing the assets of a fellow U.S. ally. This is raw, unfiltered realpolitik. It is the behavior of nations that have realized the sheriff is asleep, or perhaps that the sheriff no longer has any bullets in his gun. By allowing this festering wound to burst open, the United States has revealed its impotence. The narrative of containing Iran is now a farce. How can Washington claim to lead a coalition against Tehran when the two primary members of that coalition are effectively at war with each other? The entire security architecture that the Pentagon has spent trillions of dollars building in the Persian Gulf has just evaporated in a cloud of smoke over Mukalla. This is not just a failure of diplomacy, it is a systemic failure of the imperial model itself. The United States demands subservience, but offers no strategic vision. It demands loyalty, but provides no solutions to the existential fears of its allies. We must also recognize the historical irony here. The United States spent the last 20 years destroying the secular, independent states of the Middle East, Iraq, Libya, Syria, under the guise of democracy promotion and fighting terror. In doing so, it removed the traditional buffers that kept the regional balance of power. It unleashed chaos, believing it could manage the fallout. Now, that chaos has consumed its own friends. The vacuum left by the destruction of the old order is being filled not by American democracy, but by the ruthless ambition of local powers who no longer fear American reprimand. As we move deeper into this analysis, we will dissect the specific mechanisms of this failure. We will look at how sanctions and financial warfare have lost their bite, how the global alternatives provided by the BRICS nations have emboldened these former vassals to act independently, and how the moral bankruptcy of U.S. foreign policy has left it with no leverage to broker peace. But make no mistake, the bombing of Mukalla is the signal flare. The old world is gone. The Pax Americana is a myth. And in the smoking ruins of that weapons shipment in Yemen, we see the terrifying, exhilarating birth of a multipolar reality where the United States is just one shouting voice in a room full of deafened giants. This is the twilight of the empire, and the sun is setting faster than anyone in Washington dared to imagine. To understand why this specific act of fratricide is causing absolute panic in the corridors of the Pentagon and the State Department, we have to look beyond the smoke rising from Mukalla. We must look at the machinery of empire itself, the levers and pulleys that Washington has traditionally pulled to bring unruly vassals to heel. For 70 years, the Pax Americana was maintained not just by the presence of aircraft carriers, but by a sophisticated system of coercion involving financial dominance, logistical dependency, and the weaponization of the US dollar. The terrifying realization dawning on the establishment today is that the control panel has been smashed. The buttons they are frantically pressing are no longer connected to anything. In a previous decade, the response to Saudi Arabia bombing a UAE asset would have been swift and brutal, but bloodless. Washington would have threatened to freeze assets. It would have threatened to halt the technical support contracts that keep the Royal Saudi Air Force in the air. Remember, these militaries are addicted to American logistics. Without U.S. contractors, their jets are essentially expensive paperweights. Or at least that was the theory. That was the leverage. Do what we say, or your military stops functioning and your economy is sanctioned. It was a simple, brutal transaction that kept the peace, or rather kept the peace that Washington desired. So why did Riyadh feel emboldened to pull the trigger? And why did Abu Dhabi feel confident enough to defy Saudi interests to the point of provoking an attack and then unilaterally withdraw, leaving the U.S. strategy in tatters? The answer lies in the catastrophic overuse of American power mechanisms. By sanctioning half the globe, by weaponizing the SWIFT system against Russia, and by seizing sovereign reserves, the United States taught the world a very valuable lesson. Diversify or die. The Saudis and Emiratis are not stupid. They have watched the U.S. seizure of Russian central bank assets. They have watched the weaponization of the dollar. And they have spent the last 3 years quietly, methodically, building the infrastructure to circumvent U.S. coercion This is the system failure we are witnessing. The Saudi leadership knows that Washington's threats are now hollow because the alternative architecture is already in place. Look at the geopolitical chessboard. Both Saudi Arabia and the UAE have recently deepened their ties with the BRICS alliance. They are trading oil in yuan. They are hosting Russian diplomats. They are buying Chinese drones and missile technology. When the State Department calls Riyadh and threatens to cut off support for their American made F 15 seconds, the Crown Prince can simply glance at the catalog of hardware offered by Beijing, hardware that comes with no moral lectures, no human rights caveats, and no restrictions on how it is used against neighbors. The United States is trapped in a nightmare of its own making, the client trap. Washington cannot sanction Saudi Arabia for bombing the UAE because doing so would push the kingdom entirely into the orbit of China and Russia. It cannot sanction the UAE for destabilizing Yemen because Abu Dhabi is a critical hub for global finance and intelligence. The hegemon is paralyzed. The vassals have realized that they are too big to fail in the context of great power competition. They know the U.S. is so terrified of losing influence to China that it will tolerate almost any behavior from its traditional allies. This reverses the entire polarity of the relationship. The client is now dictating terms to the patron. Furthermore, the media narrative, another crucial pillar of imperial control, has shattered. Usually, when a conflict breaks out that undermines U.S. interests, the Western media apparatus kicks into high gear to paint one side as the villain and the other as the victim, creating a moral pretext for intervention. But here, the narrative is incoherent. How does the New York Times explain a war between two U.S. allies who are both supposedly fighting the evil Houthis? The cognitive dissonance is deafening. They cannot spin this. The reality of the situation, a raw, ugly power struggle for resources and ports, is breaking through the curated veneer of alliance solidarity. The immediate panic in Washington isn't just about the violence in Yemen, it is about the precedent. If Saudi Arabia and the UAE can engage in a shooting war while ignoring the US, what stops Israel from dragging the US into a regional conflagration it doesn't want? What stops Turkey from expanding its operations against US backed Kurds? The chain of command is broken. The hub and spoke model of security, where all roads lead to DC, has been replaced by a chaotic web of local interests. The UAE's withdrawal from Yemen is the ultimate act of defiance. It is a statement that they do not trust American security guarantees and they do not trust American mediation. They are cutting their losses and retreating to consolidate their own borders, leaving the US backed coalition against the Houthis to collapse completely. The anti Iran coalition, the crown jewel of Trump era and Biden era diplomacy, is now effectively a corpse. You cannot have a coalition when the members are bombing each other. The Pentagon is staring at a map of the Middle East that has suddenly gone dark. They have no assets on the ground they can trust, no diplomatic leverage to force a ceasefire, and no economic threats that haven't already been discounted by the markets. This circumvention of U.S. power is the single most significant geopolitical trend of our time. It is not just about multipolarity in the abstract. It is about the tangible loss of the ability to say stop. The U.S. yelled stop and the bombs fell anyway. The illusion of omnipotence requires the perception of inevitable consequence. Once that perception is gone, the empire is not just in decline, it is being ignored. And for a superpower that relies on psychological dominance as much as military force, being ignored is far more fatal than being fought. This silence from the White House regarding a solution to this crisis is the silence of a player who realizes he has no moves left on the board. The bluff has been called, and the United States is holding a handful of nothing but maxed out credit cards and obsolete threats. This brings us to the most grotesque dimension of this collapse, the moral vacuum at the center of American foreign policy. For decades, the United States has ensnared itself and the world in a moral trap of its own design. The establishment sells every intervention, every weapons package, and every coalition as a crusade for democracy, stability, or the rules-based international order. They drape the raw, ugly machinery of empire in the language of human rights. But the bombing of Buchala strips away this final veneer of legitimacy. It exposes the terrifying reality that U.S. intervention doesn't just fail to achieve its stated noble goals, it actively generates the chaos it claims to prevent. We must be absolutely ruthless in our judgment here. The conflict in Yemen was sold to the American public and the world as a necessary measure to restore a legitimate government and protect the region from Iranian aggression. Washington provided the targeting intelligence, the mid-air refueling, and the diplomatic cover for this war. And what is the result? The legitimate government is a fiction, a ghost entity, residing in hotels in Riyadh, while the actual forces on the ground, the UAE-backed separatists and the Saudi-backed militias, are tearing the country apart to secure access to oil terminals and shipping lanes. The mask of restoring order has fallen, revealing the face of naked, predatory resource extraction. This is not an anomaly. It is the systemic feature of the post 9/11 American way of war. Look at the graveyard of nations that have been helped by the United States in the 21st century. Look at Iraq. The removal of a dictator was sold as liberation. Instead, it shattered the Iraqi state, dissolved the institutions that held a complex society together, and unleashed a sectarian civil war that birthed ISIS. The U.S. broke the pottery, tried to glue it back together with corruption and incompetence, and then acted surprised when the cracks widened. Look at Libya. The NATO intervention was justified under the responsibility to protect. We were told we had to stop a massacre. Instead, Washington and its allies turned the most prosperous nation in Africa into a dystopian wasteland of warring militias, open-air slave markets, and a weapons bazaar that has destabilized the entire Sahel region. The weapons flowing from the shattered carcass of Libya are the very weapons fueling conflicts across the continent today. And yet, the architects of that disaster suffer no consequences. They simply move to think tanks to plan the next catastrophe. Look at Syria. The covert and overt attempt to topple the government under the guise of supporting moderate rebels merely prolonged a horrific war, displaced millions, and created a vacuum that invited every jihadist psychopath in the hemisphere to set up shop. The U.S. strategy of regime change never considers the day after. It assumes that if you remove the bad guy, Jeffersonian democracy will spontaneously erupt from the sand. It is a delusion so profound it borders on criminal insanity. And now, Yemen. The United States enabled the Saudi and Emirati intervention, selling them billions in weapons, knowing full well that their strategic objectives were divergent. Washington essentially subcontracted its regional security to two rival monarchs, handed them matches and gasoline, and is now feigning shock that the house is burning down. The moral trap is this: by justifying these alliances based on security, the U.S. becomes complicit in every atrocity, every betrayal, and every act of incompetence committed by its partners. When a Saudi jet drops an American-made bomb on an Emirati-controlled port, the blood is not just on the hands of the pilot, it is on the hands of the bureaucrats in D.C. who approve the sale. This hypocrisy is toxic. It destroys American credibility faster than any Chinese economic initiative ever could. The global South is watching. When the U.S. lectures African or Asian nations on sovereignty and territorial integrity in Ukraine, those nations look at Yemen, they look at Syria, they see that for the United States, sovereignty is a conditional concept. It applies only to friends of the empire, and even then, only when it is convenient. If you are a U.S. ally bombing another U.S. ally, sovereignty is irrelevant. It is a complex internal situation. The consequences of this coercion are playing out in real time. By relying on military force and coercion rather than genuine diplomacy, the U.S. has created a region where force is the only language anyone speaks. Because Washington destroyed the traditional diplomatic balances in the Middle East, every local power now believes that the only way to secure its interests is through violence. The Saudis bomb because they believe the U.S. won't stop them. The Emiratis seize ports because they believe might makes right, a lesson they learned from the master. This leads to the ultimate fracturing of the region. We are not just seeing the end of the U.S. alliance, we are seeing the balkanization of the Middle East facilitated by American ineptitude. Instead of a stable region flowing with energy to the West, we are staring at a patchwork of warlord run fiefdoms. And the tragedy is that this was predictable. Realist critics warned for years that uncritically backing the Gulf monarchies' adventures in Yemen would lead to quagmire and blowback. But the arrogant establishment, drunk on the illusion of indispensable power, refused to listen. Now, they are trapped. They cannot condemn the Saudis without losing the petrodollar. They cannot condemn the Emiratis without losing a key intelligence hub against Iran. They have sold their soul for strategic assets, and now those assets are turning into liabilities. The moral high ground is gone. The beacon of freedom has been exposed as the merchant of chaos. And in the ruthless court of geopolitics, a power that has lost its moral authority is a power that is already dead. It just hasn't finished collapsing yet. The world is recoiling from this spectacle, realizing that to be an ally of the United States is to be invited into a slaughterhouse where the butcher is blind and the knives are sharp. While the Pentagon scrambles to map the cratering of its alliance structure in the Arabian Peninsula, the true beneficiaries of this catastrophe are watching from Beijing and Moscow with a sense of grim satisfaction. This is the global reckoning. The fracture between Saudi Arabia and the UAE is not an isolated incident of friendly fire. It is a geostrategic gift to the great power rivals of the United States. We are witnessing the unfolding of a masterclass in asymmetric warfare, where the East wins not by matching American military tonnage, but by exploiting the gaping voids left by American diplomatic incompetence. Consider the optics of this moment. While Washington's two closest Arab partners are engaging in kinetic warfare against one another, China is positioning itself as the only adult in the room. Remember, it was Beijing that brokered the détente between Saudi Arabia and Iran, a diplomatic breakthrough that the United States deemed impossible, largely because the U.S. thrives on the tension, not the resolution. Now, as U.S. backed security architectures collapse into fratricidal violence, China presents itself as the guarantor of stability and commerce. This is the essence of the new asymmetry. The United States offers weapons and demands obedience. China offers infrastructure, energy contracts, and demands only trade. To a global South exhausted by endless wars and conditional friendships, the Chinese model is becoming irresistibly attractive. The collapse of the anti-Iran coalition in Yemen effectively hands the Red Sea, one of the world's most critical maritime choke points, over to the forces of multipolarity. The United States Navy cannot police every inch of the ocean. It relied on a unified front of local allies to secure the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. With the UAE withdrawing and Saudi Arabia distracted by fighting its own allies, the security vacuum will be filled by others. We should expect to see an increase in Chinese naval presence in the region, ostensibly to protect trade routes that the U.S. can no longer secure. This is how empires die, not by invasion, but by displacement. The hegemon ceases to be the provider of public goods like maritime security, and a rival power steps in to pick up the slack, and with it, the influence. Russia, too, plays a critical role in this reckoning. The fracture in the Gulf destroys any hope the Biden administration had of coercing OPEC Plus to lower oil prices or increase production to hurt the Russian economy. Why would Riyadh or Abu Dhabi do favors for a Washington that cannot even mediate a dispute between them? Instead, this chaos drives the Gulf monarchies closer to Moscow. They see in Putin a leader who stands by his allies, witness Assad in Syria, compared to the fickleness of American support. The coordination between the Saudis and Russians on energy policy will tighten. The oil weapon, once the exclusive domain of American foreign policy, has been seized by the producers. This ensures that the inflationary pressure on the Western economies will remain high, a direct tax on the American consumer imposed by the failures of their own foreign policy establishment. This is the economic blowback of geopolitical incompetence. The average American might wonder why a skirmish in a Yemeni port matters to their 401k or their grocery bill. It matters because global markets hate uncertainty, and the US led order was supposed to be the insurance policy against that uncertainty. When that insurance policy is voided, risk premiums skyrocket. The instability in the Gulf threatens the free flow of energy, which feeds directly into inflation. The disruption of shipping lanes forces vessels to take longer, more expensive routes, raising the cost of everything from electronics to grain. The chaos tax is real, and it is being levied on the West because its leaders insisted on maintaining a hegemony they could no longer afford or manage. Furthermore, the global South is taking notes. Nations across Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia are witnessing the disintegration of the U.S. alliance network and drawing the obvious conclusion reliance on Washington is a liability. We are seeing a diplomatic mobilization of the non aligned too. These nations are accelerating their applications to BRICS. They are setting up currency swap lines to bypass the US dollar, not out of ideological hatred, but out of survival instinct. If the US dollar system exposes them to sanctions, and the US security umbrella exposes them to wars with their neighbors, the rational choice is to exit the system. The Saudi UAE conflict is the catalyst that accelerates this exodus. It proves that the rules based order is neither orderly nor ruled by law, but is a chaotic free for all where even the sheriff's deputies are shooting at each other. The response from the collective West has been a mixture of denial and hysterical impotence. We see European leaders rushing to the Gulf to beg for energy assurances, only to be met with polite indifference. We see the U.S. State Department issuing empty statements, calling for restraint, words that have lost all meaning. The asymmetric advantage of the multipolar powers is that they do not need to dominate the Middle East to win. They simply need to let the United States fail. Every bomb dropped by a Saudi jet on an Emirati position is a propaganda victory for Beijing and Moscow that they didn't have to pay for. It reinforces the narrative that the era of Western stewardship is over and that the Garden of the West is actually the source of the jungle's fire. We are moving into a period of extreme danger, the interregnum. The old world is dying, and the new one struggles to be born. In this twilight, the risk of miscalculation is massive. As the U.S. realizes it has lost control of its proxies, the temptation to lash out, to engage in a demonstration of force, to remind the world of its power, becomes terrifyingly high. But even military might has its limits in this new landscape. You cannot bomb an alliance back together. You cannot shoot your way out of a diplomatic collapse. The aircraft carriers can sail in circles, but they cannot fix the fundamental trust deficit that has shattered the Middle East. The asymmetric war has been won by the powers of the global South because they played the long game of economic integration and sovereignty, while Washington played the short game of coups and coercion. Now, the bill for that short-sightedness has arrived, and the currency required to pay it credibility is the one thing the United States no longer possesses. The smoking ruins in Mukalla are not just a tactical failure. They are the physical manifestation of a strategic dead end. For the United States, the luxury of denial is no longer affordable. The empire faces a binary choice, a choice that will determine not just the future of the Middle East, but the survival of the American Republic itself. It is a choice between a painful adaptation to reality or a suicidal clinging to a delusion. The first option is the path of humility and restraint. It requires Washington to accept that the unipolar moment of 1991 was a historical anomaly, a brief aberration that has now corrected itself. It requires the establishment to admit that the United States can no longer dictate the internal politics of the Persian Gulf, that it can no longer print its way to prosperity, and that it can no longer bomb its way to peace. A rational superpower would look at the Saudi UAE conflict, realize its leverage is gone, and begin a strategic withdrawal, retrenching to the Western Hemisphere, rebuilding its crumbling domestic infrastructure, and accepting its role as one great power among many in a multipolar concert of nations. It would mean becoming a normal country rather than a crusading empire. But if history is our guide, the United States will almost certainly choose the second option, the path of hubris. Empires rarely dismantle themselves voluntarily. They rage against the dying of the light. They double down on the very strategies that caused their decline. We should expect Washington to react to this failure not with introspection, but with escalation. They will likely attempt to force loyalty through even more draconian sanctions, or worse, manufacture a new external crisis to force the Saudis and Emiratis back into line. This is the danger of the wounded animal phase of hegemony. A declining power is often more dangerous than a rising one because it is desperate, unpredictable, and prone to catastrophic miscalculation. The conflict in Yemen proves that the myth of American exceptionalism is dead. The idea that the United States possesses a unique moral virtue that grants it the right to police the globe has been shattered by the reality of its own allies, bombing each other with American weapons. The city on a hill is burning, and the fire was started from within. The world has moved on. The global south is building new roads, laying new pipelines, and forging new alliances that bypass Washington entirely. They are not waiting for permission anymore. We are witnessing the closing of a chapter in human history. The era where the West commanded and the rest obeyed is over. The silence you hear from the White House is the sound of a worldview collapsing. The chaos in the Middle East is merely the birth pangs of the new order, a messy, multipolar, and ruthlessly realist world where power is measured in tangible assets, not in empty rhetoric about democracy. The sun has set on the American century. The question is no longer how to save the empire, but how to survive its collapse. This channel exists to document that collapse without the filter of mainstream propaganda. If you want to understand the mechanics of this new world order and prepare yourself for the shifts that are coming, you need to subscribe. We do not sell hope. We analyze reality. Like this video to help the algorithm break through the censorship, and share this with anyone who still believes the official narrative. I want to hear your analysis in the comments below. Here are 2 questions to consider. First, do you believe the United States will accept its decline and retreat peacefully, or will it lash out and trigger a major global conflict to maintain its position? Second, with the U.S. alliance in the Middle East effectively dead, which power will become the dominant broker in the region by 2030? China, Russia, or a resurgent regional power like Iran? State your case below. I will be reading